Good evening and welcome to the St. Louis Zoo for our last science seminar series of this school year. Earlier today, I was looking at the numbers, and so far we've had 1,200 people attend the first 5 of the series. So we'll be over 1,400 people attending this series this year. And I applaud everybody here for coming because you oftentimes come to many of them. And we'll be starting the planning process for next year. And we're looking at having probably another 6 programs in 2008, 2009. The St. Louis Zoo is very pleased to participate with the Academy of Science in this series. And before I introduce Rose from the Academy, I just want to mention, because tonight's topic is dealing with amphibian biodiversity, we had a program at the beginning of March, which was when we had that real bad snow, and it was on amphibian decline and amphibian crisis, and that has been postponed because of the weather. And if anybody's interested in learning more from tonight's topic, it's going to take place on April 22nd, Earth Day, and you can get more information by calling the Zoo Education Department. So with that, I'd like to introduce Rose Jansen with the Academy of Science.
Well, good evening. We're glad that you're here with us tonight. This evening's talk, and Jim may have already said, is part of a partnership series of public science seminars on topical and timely issues in science, and it's a collaborative effort of the Zoo and the Academy of Science. And for those of you who don't know who we are a local not-for-profit. We serve the St. Louis community and surrounding counties. We've been doing that since 1856. We're dedicated to advancing the public understanding of science and inspiring the next generation of scientists and science advocates. And we continue to advance our mission with free and low-cost lectures and seminar series, trips and tours that celebrate science at venues throughout the region. And for more information on our free and low-cost community-wide events and programs, you can visit our website at www.academyofsciencestl.org, or you can pick up some of the literature that's on the membership desk on your way out of the auditorium this evening. If you'd like to receive e-notification of upcoming Academy and St. Louis Zoo public lectures and events, there will be some e-news sign-up sheets that'll make their way around the audience this evening. And there's also one at the membership desk as well. Tonight's talk is on amphibian declines have been observed across the world in some of the most pristine habitats on Earth. Absorbing the world around them through their skin, they are particularly susceptible to a litany of biotic and abiotic threats, making them the proverbial canaries in the coal mine. Here tonight to tell us about his work in partnership with laboratory colleagues, faculty at other universities throughout the U.S. and state and federal agencies is Dr. John Chase. Using basic rules of community ecology to help to understand how amphibian biodiversity, along with the biodiversity of associated organisms, responds to anthropogenic changes, Dr. Chase discusses how information gleaned from his work can be used to help guide restoration efforts of our threatened and endangered communities. Dr. Chase is an associate professor of biology and arts and sciences at Washington University in St. Louis, and he is director of the university's Tyson Research Center. Combining mathematical theory, observations, statistical approaches, rigorous experimentation in both the field and lab, and a knowledge of natural history, he focuses his research on the rules that underlie the diversity, distribution, and abundance of animal and plant species from the population, community, ecosystem perspective. He is particularly interested in the patterns and processes that develop at the interface between local and regional spatial scales. He is co-author of Ecological Niches, Linking Classical and Contemporary Approaches. Won't you join me in welcoming tonight's Science Seminar Series speaker, Dr. Jonathan Chase.
Well, thank you very much. It's indeed a pleasure to be here, and I just got done giving another talk to a smaller group, and so I'm excited to get to present this sort of the work that will present some of the work that we've been doing here in my group and colleagues of mine, but I'm going to talk about the concept of amphibian declines in an ecological context in a much broader realm. And so I'm going to talk about my work and intermingle it with a lot of the other research that's been going on in the community for the past 20 years or so. Now, first, let's start and talk about amphibians and why we need to think about these as a distinct group of organisms. I'm a community ecologist, and so I study a variety of organisms in addition to amphibians. But why are we particularly interested in amphibians? And so here is just sort of, let's see, the sort of proverbial tree of life that you sort of can pull off of any Google search or anything like that, where you can look at the variety of diversity that has evolved on the planet. And what we're going to be talking about today is right here at this tip, and we're not going to be talking about poodles. I'm not sure why a poodle is there in the vertebrate category, but what we're going to be talking about is this particular group of organisms, the amphibians. Now, why are we interested in amphibians? Well, one of the reasons why we're interested in them is because they're sort of a unique group within the vertebrates, and the uniqueness of them presents some challenges as well as some interesting sort of relationships that they have with the environment around them. And so this is just sort of a very basic evolutionary perspective of where amphibians came from. We know that they had some sort of common ancestor with fishes many, many years ago, lobe-finned fishes in particular, that probably wriggled around in swampy mud as the world was drying, evolved to sort of move around on those fins, which turned into limbs, and that's how we sort of got the radiation of amphibians. Another group of those early things went on to reptiles, and then, of course, to mammals and birds. So here, what we're going to particularly focus on is this group of amphibians, and I want to just give you a little bit of introduction to the diversity of amphibians. And of course, this is going to be a very superficial introduction. If you're really interested in this stuff, the zoo, I haven't actually been to it, but has a great new exhibit on amphibians and on some of these issues. One of the reasons they asked me to give this talk this year is because the American Association of Amphibian Conservationists and other people have named this the Year of the Frog to raise awareness of the issues that amphibians are dealing with. And so I hope to be able to do a little bit of that with you today. So let's just talk a little bit about the diversity of amphibians. Well, the first group most of you are probably pretty familiar with. We call these Anurans. These are the order Anurans, and there's over 5,000 species that we know of these organisms and a variety of different families. And these include the common neighborhood animals that you're probably all familiar with, our friendly green frog, the American toad. You see those, we have these in the neighborhoods in St. Louis and other places. And also some much more interesting and diverse organisms that, this is a tree frog here with the spines on it. This is a poison dart frog that can become very toxic to organisms that might want to eat it, and it actually can get those toxins out of its prey, which is probably ants, so they can actually become quite toxic. And some very funky-looking guys, like the narrow-mouthed toad and what's called Pac-Man frog, because this huge mouth that this thing has. So there's a huge variety of these organisms. There's another group of organisms. This is a different order. We call these Caudata, and these include the salamanders and newts. Now, just like frogs and toads are a family of this broader group of frogs. Newts are a family of the broader group of salamanders. And these include, again, the guys that we see here, right here in Missouri, not too far away. We can find all of these species, including some aquatic species and some terrestrial species entirely. These can also include some of the more funky-looking individuals. Many of you have probably heard of the hellbender. It's a particular conservation concern, and I'll talk a little bit about this guy a little bit later. Or the Asian giant salamanders, the largest salamander in the world in this particular family called the Cryptobranchidae. And then we get some other funky guys like the mud puppy here, which never loses its gills. It stays what we call neotenic. It keeps its gills in its larval form throughout its adult life. So that's a mud puppy, and these are its gills here, where it's exchanging oxygen with the water. Here we have an Amphiuma that is essentially legless. Some of them have tiny toes, so they can actually lose their legs through evolutionary processes. And then this guy here is actually a cliff climber, so it can climb up on cliffs in North Carolina. So there's a huge diversity of these things. And then the last group of amphibians is probably one most of you haven't even heard of. We call these the Gymnophionans or the Caecilians. There are actually 170 species of these in 6 families. I've personally never seen one in the wild. I have seen some in captivity. Now, what is a Caecilian? Those of you who have seen The Princess Bride, might remember that you shouldn't match wits with a Sicilian, but it's not this. In fact, they're much more drab-looking organisms in some ways, but they can be quite beautiful, like this orange one here. Most of them, they're entirely legless for the most part. They have sensor organisms. Most of them are entirely blind. Many of them swim. Some of them live under the dirt and under rocks and logs and things. So this is another group of amphibians that's its own entire order. Most of us think about amphibians, and we think about the classic life cycle that we hear about in elementary school and throughout the rest of our lives, and we think about sort of this 2 life stages that they have and the metamorphosis that occurs that allows them to go from one life stage to another. And generally, we think of the generalized thing, live in a pond as a tadpole, live on the land as an adult. And they lay their eggs in the pond, we get these sorts of tadpoles, and then we finally get our adult. And this is the life cycle of the gray tree frog, which is a very common species in this area. You can see he has these beautiful red tails, and that red tail actually provides defense against dragonfly predators. It's a pretty cool adaptation that these things have to escaping dragonfly predators. But in fact, the amphibian, and particular frogs, are much more diverse than this very simplistic idea. There are many different types of tadpoles that occur in the world, and they have very different niches in which they live. Many of them are filter feeders. Some of them are grazers and shredders. Some have actually turned into predators. There's a desert spadefoot toad that if it gets into the ponds early, it can eat individuals of the same species, and they can become cannibalistic as a tadpole. And so you get a variety of variation. In fact, we also get variation in whether or not they even become tadpoles or whether they even bother with the tadpole life stage. And so here, it's a little difficult to see, but there's a little baby frog inside of this egg. And what it's done is it's foregone the tadpole stage. I mean, it hasn't really. It's still a tadpole, but it's staying in the egg throughout its entire development. And then it can hop out onto land. And so through evolution, these things have figured out a variety of different ways to deal with the world around them. And there's a variety of different types of care that these animals can provide to their offspring. Here is a redback salamander protecting its eggs. This is a poison dart frog, and this is the father, and he carries the tadpoles around on his back, and he'll move them from little site to site, and they often live in bromeliads, in the little water that lives in bromeliads, and he'll carry them from site to site. And oftentimes the female will come in and lay an unfertilized egg into those habitats to feed the tadpole. So there's a lot of paternal care in some of these things, and they're trying to avoid sort of dealing with that. Just let your babies off into the water and let them go. Here we have a marsupial frog, and this thing has laid the eggs here on the back, and the skin has overgrown the top of the eggs, and the babies are developing inside this pouch, essentially. And finally, we have the gastric breeding frog, and what it does is it swallows the egg and actually doesn't eat for a long time period while that egg is developing, and then the babies come out of the mouth. So there's a lot of different ways that they've learned to deal with this sort of 2-stage problem, larvae and adult. But for the most part, most generalized amphibians do use that larvae and adult, and that's one of the things that will come back into play later on in determining why they might be so vulnerable to some of the problems that we're experiencing in the world around us. So why are we talking about amphibian declines, and what do we mean by extinction? Well, I want to start out just a little bit more general. So what's a mass extinction? Most of you are probably sort of at least vaguely familiar with the ideas of a mass extinction. And oftentimes when we think of a mass extinction, we think of something like the dinosaurs going extinct due to maybe a meteorite hitting the planet, which is one of the well-known theories. And today we think that we're perhaps in the midst of another mass extinction. But this mass extinction is probably due to one particular species, and that species is us. And this is just a little map of the world showing the impact, and the redder it is, the more the impact is that the humans are having on the planet. And so you can just see the proportion of the land mass that humans are using and what effect this is having on the biodiversity around us. One of the fundamental principles that we know in biodiversity is when there's less area available for animals and plants to live, there are going to be fewer species. It's called the species-area relationship. And so as humans are taking more and more land, there's less and less land available for species. And this, by definition, is going to cause a lot of extinctions. And so we're in the midst of a mass extinction that is being caused by humans. And you can actually see this if we start looking at fossil record and things like that. We actually know that there are probably several mass extinctions that have occurred through the history of the planet. We're most familiar probably with this one that occurred at the KT boundary where the dinosaurs went extinct. But in fact, there were some much more dramatic ones previous to that. And even before, there were mass extinctions that occurred at multiple times in multiple places. And here we are in the midst of potentially another mass extinction. And so one of the questions that we often get, especially if I maybe am talking to a paleontologist friend who's interested in this huge span of time in which organisms are present on the planet, is, isn't extinction natural? Isn't that part of the process? In fact, it is. Every species will go extinct. It's by definition. Every species will be born and go extinct, or speciate and go extinct. And so what we're interested in is, are we doing something different than what's going on in the background? Are we really influencing this extinction rate? And in fact, these are some results that came out of the Millennium Ecosystem Assessment that was done. It was a program that was put together by the United Nations where thousands of scientists across the world got together to define the state of the world's ecosystems, in particular the impact that we as humans were having on the state of the world's ecosystems. And so the results from the Millennium Ecosystem Assessment were coming out over the past several years, and this is just sort of a cartoon of some of the results with relation to extinction rates. And so indeed, species always go extinct. That's what they do. But the rates at which they go extinct was much, much, much lower than it seems to be today. And what we project into the future is that it's going to be continually higher and higher as humans continue to reduce the amount of land mass that's available to these other organisms on the planet. So here we are in the midst of what's potentially, we know we're causing some extinctions. It's likely that we're causing a mass extinction. So what does this all have to do with amphibians? You can probably, many of you probably have heard, there's great champions of talking about biodiversity and mass extinctions. Peter Raven right here in the city. He has a wonderful, brilliant talk about biodiversity declines and things like that. So what I want to tell you about today is sort of where do amphibians fit in? And why do we maybe want to think about amphibians as something that might give us some ideas about what is going on at the broader scale, but also might have some sort of special results as well, some special relationships with environmental change. And so this is the question. As we're talking here about the year of the frog, amphibian declines, we're talking about it as facts. And so what I want to do is go a little bit through the history of where we've come from and how we've come to decide that these are facts. And this is just sort of an overview of the global diversity of amphibian species. And in fact, if you look at data, these are just sort of the hotter and colder colors tell you where there are more species and where there are fewer species of amphibians across the globe. And what this is showing us is essentially the same thing that we would see for any other variety of species. If I were to plot out these same data for reptiles, for mammals, for birds, we would see there's some differences. Amphibians in particular had a nice diversification here in the southeast. There's some differences, but for the most part, these things overlap. Vertebrate species and invertebrates as well, and plants tend to show these same sorts of patterns of biodiversity. But we tend to think that amphibians might be doing something a little bit different. And so here's one of the reasons. This is sort of the poster child for why we might think they're doing something a little bit different. And this poster child really got the attention of conservationists in the 80s and 90s. And this is the golden toad. And the golden toad lived in these pristine forests of Monte Verde, Costa Rica. Beautiful area, cloud forest. And the golden toad was discovered by a man named Jay Savage, a professor at the University of Miami, in 1966. And they were doing quite well. They were flourishing. They were quite happy little toads hopping around and doing their business. And they did so for about 20 or so years. They were studied. They were, doing quite well. And then sometime in the 80s, they went on this massive precipitous decline. They started really tailing off. And by 1989, they were extinct. Extinct, gone from the wild. And so this was an example of one of these very abrupt, and this really got our attention. We know we had driven species extinct. We know examples of the passenger pigeons and dodos and other things. But this is one of those examples in modern times where humans witnessed this massive precipitous decline and extinction of these animals. And this is sort of what has led to the supposition that maybe amphibians might be considered something like a canary in the coal mine. What do we mean by canary in the coal mine? It's a pretty obvious analogy. Miners brought canaries into the coal mine. If there were any noxious gases floating around in there, the canary would be more susceptible to them than the humans, it would get sick and die, and the people would know they better get out. So this has been sort of thought of that maybe this sort of canary in the coal mine analogy might be something that we need to worry about as we start seeing these amphibians sort of showing these declines, and in particular using the golden toad as sort of an example. And so why might this be the case? Well, in fact, there are a couple of reasons. There are many reasons why, but there are a couple of reasons that I'll focus on. One that I've already mentioned is many of them tend to depend on two habitat types. And so not only do they have to worry about destruction, most species have to worry about habitat destruction, but these guys have to worry about habitat destruction in two different habitats. So either larval habitat gets destroyed or adult habitat gets destroyed, but that still messes up your populations. And the other thing is that they have this extremely permeable skin. They use it for respiration. They respire. A lot of their oxygen comes through their skin, either through the water or through the air. And they're essentially absorbing their environment. And I'm a little bit remiss to say that I was talking to a newspaper reporter about some studies that were coming out about this stuff, and I let it slip that I said amphibians indeed are the wimps of the amphibian world. And I mean that in the most endearing way possible, because they're wonderful species, but they really are. It's not necessarily very surprising that some of these toxins and contaminants in the environment are going to affect them, because they really are, communicating with their environment much more readily than a reptile or a bird or a mammal. They're really having this direct connection with the environment. They're absorbing that through their skin. So about this time, we were starting to say, okay, we think amphibian declines are a problem. We think maybe they're the canary in the coal mine. And some ecologists sort of said, hey, wait a minute, guys. Slow down. Are we really seeing amphibian declines, or are these just the normal fluctuations that we see in day out? In ecology, we know we see booms and busts. We see, we know about locusts and other sorts of really rapid population dynamics like lemmings show and other species. So maybe amphibians are just showing these boom and busts, and maybe the golden toad was just an anomaly, or maybe some of these declines we're seeing are just temporary. And these are just some data that these ecologists put together from a variety of different species, showing that even over a 10, 20-year span, you can see the huge variation that both the larvae, the metamorphosing juveniles, the little metamorphs that come out of the water, and the breeding adults have from year to year. Look, this one's really going up, this one's really going down. There's a lot of variation that these animals are showing. And so these people were even debating whether or not these amphibian declines were even going on. And this is sort of where we were in the 90s. Is, yes, we think that something's going on. Yes, we think that the amphibians, we know that there are lots of extinctions across the, biodiversity, and we think amphibians might be special, but we're not quite sure. And so the first question that we have to ask is, are these amphibian declines different in their magnitude and kind from just what's going on? What's normal extinction rate, this background extinction rate, or even what other species are doing? Are they unique? Are they different from birds and mammals and reptiles? And if so, what's going on? Why are they doing this? So ultimately, we need to ask, is the golden toad unlucky, or is there something else going on? And these are a bit of data that I'll come back to, and these are data collected by Karen Lips and a variety of researchers. Karen's at the University of Southern Illinois at Carbondale. And she's been monitoring these populations of amphibians in Costa Rica and Panama and streams and rivers in the cloud forests. And you can see this is just the number of amphibians sort of seen per person per unit time through time. And, actually it seems like there might even be increasing, but they're certainly doing fine for the first, 7 or 8 years of the study. But then, boom, something happened in 2005, between 2004 and 2005. And in fact, these sorts of evidences have been coming up time and time again, where we really see these precipitous crashes that seem outside the realm of the data that we see in other studies. And we see it time and time again. In the Sierra Nevada, 5 of 7 species were thought to be declining seriously. In Australia, 14 species disappeared or declined suddenly in the mid-90s. And at Monteverde, where the golden toad was, 40% of the frog species disappeared during the late 80s. So it really does seem like something unique is going on with these animals. And in fact, if you start looking at a little bit of data, a little bit of proportions, in fact, you can see that there are a number, this 12% or 23% of birds and mammals respectively are sort of what we call threatened globally. Now, the exact terminology of what threatened means is a little bit difficult to describe, but it's just sort of all of the information that's available for these populations and whether or not they're threatened with extinction. A good chunk of birds and mammals are threatened, but actually 32% of amphibians seem to be threatened. And this seems to be significantly bigger, greater than what's going on with birds and mammals. What I think is a little more striking for me is that 168 of these species are presumed extinct in the wild that have been discovered. Many, many more have not been discovered. Remember, the golden toad was only discovered in the 60s. Many new species are still being discovered today. 100 species since 1980 have been observed to go globally extinct, and this seems to be a rate that's faster than many of the other groups of organisms. And this seems to be going on across the world. These colors here simply represent the numbers of species of amphibians that are threatened in different parts of the world, and you can see they seem to be in the same places where there were those hot spots, and it's spread throughout the whole world where these species are threatened with extinction. And in fact, here in Missouri, we have some species of conservation concern. I already mentioned the hellbender, the Ozark hellbender. If you visited the exhibit here at the zoo, they have a wonderful efforts here at the zoo for captive breeding of these animals. The dilemma is they're not reproducing well in the wild. We almost never find juveniles anymore, and we don't know what's going on with the Ozark hellbenders. Also, there are several other species in the state that are sort of rare and of conservation concern, including things like the northern leopard frog, the Illinois chorus frog, the crawfish frog. Things like the wood frog are sort of considered to be a bit of conservation concern as well. Why do we care? Well, most of you are probably here because you're interested in amphibians, so it's kind of preaching to the choir a little bit here. But there are various reasons why we might want to care about biodiversity, in particular about biodiversity of amphibians. The first one that people like to say, and every time I talk to a newspaper reporter about these kinds of problems, this is what they want, because this is what gets people interested and excited. Utilitarian sort of reasons. What does it do for me? And I really hate this one because I feel like it's very difficult for us to ascribe value to any given organism. And as soon as you put value to an organism, that puts it in the economic context and puts it in a market, and that's a very difficult thing to do. Regardless, there are some good reasons why there are uses of amphibians for our own purposes. There are things like the skin peptides that they secrete have been found to have properties that kill bacteria and other microbes, as well as even viruses like the HIV. So there might be some sort of chemical things that we often find in plants. Amphibians have a very interesting and diverse group of chemicals that might be actually useful. They also provide a variety of important services. We call them ecosystem services, and these services include everything from eating algae in the wetlands and keeping the algae down, to eating insects like mosquitoes and other things that might actually transmit viruses and pathogens. There are ethical and moral reasons why we should preserve biodiversity. This is a very difficult one to put a handle on, but I think this is probably one of the easier ones to justify. I mean, we are dealing with unprecedented levels of extinction, and so if we are concerned about this, this should give us some impetus to try to conserve them. And then we don't even know what the influence is once we start losing some of these species, and we are seeing massive losses of some of these species in some habitats, what the impacts of that will be on the other parts of the ecosystem. Frogs and toads and salamanders and things are important predators in ecosystems. Sometimes they're very important prey to snakes and other species. And we don't know what the ripple effects will be of losing this huge group of organisms that can often be quite abundant in the ecosystem. Now, I've already mentioned this briefly. The number one cause of biodiversity loss is undeniably habitat loss. It's a very simple, very easy thing to talk about. Less area, fewer species. We see it time and time again. And so no matter how many parks we put out there, we're always going to lose a few species because those parks are not going to encompass the entire globe, right? And so we're always going to have a little bit of species loss with habitat loss. These things are the obvious sorts of habitat losses that we know, like deforestation and building houses, as well as things like department stores, Walmarts and such. These habitat losses have a huge influence. Well, What does that have to say about amphibian declines? What does this tell us about amphibian declines? In fact, we've seen amphibian declines across the globe, and these are just a few points that have been sort of where some of these declines have been observed all over the globe. And the question is, have they been observed in the same places where habitat loss has occurred? Certainly habitat loss is occurring globally, and so it's always going to affect, there can always be ripple effects. But sometimes we're seeing these amphibian declines in some of the most pristine places in the world. And so we're protecting the habitats where some of these amphibians are, and they're still crashing. They're still going extinct. Monteverde, as I've already mentioned, is a national park in the cloud forest. Yosemite National Park has seen precipitous declines of things like the mountain yellow-legged frog. In Australia, we're seeing massive declines. In Panama, we're seeing declines. In some of these much more pristine areas. And so habitat loss alone can't explain it. There has to be more to it. And this is where ecologists have sort of started to really buzz and try to figure out what's the cause of amphibian decline. And that's what we'll often hear on the radio, and that's what gets our papers published in hot journals, and that's what you read and all of these things. And these things include, of course, habitat loss and its related sort of cousin, fragmentation, invasive species, overexploitation. In fact, some amphibians are overexploited for frog legs, for other sorts of food processes and other things. Parasites and disease we'll come to a lot in a little bit. Climate change, and then this other thing, where the canaries in the coal mine comes in, the sort of wimpiness of them as they absorb pesticides and insecticides and other things. But what I really want to emphasize to you today is that I think it's a little bit naive in what ecologists and the general public sort of wants to get a smoking gun. We want to say this is the cause of amphibian declines or of whatever it is that we're interested in. In fact, ecology is much more complex. It's this dynamic set of interacting factors that are probably all influencing these declines. And we see this time and time again. We see that, well, maybe one thing might weaken the population or the immune system of an organism, but it's still doing okay. You bring in the second one, and it's more than the sum of its two parts. It then knocks it extinct. So it's really the interaction between two factors that can often cause these amphibian declines, or is probably a more likely reason for some of these declines than any one of these things. And yet I'm still going to spend the next 10, 15 minutes talking about these different single factors. And then we'll see, how these things, we need to consider them all in a much richer milieu of what's really going on in these causing these declines. Okay, so the first thing I want to talk about is habitat and how habitat can influence amphibians. And this is a very interesting result that's near and dear to my heart because as Rose mentioned, I'm the director of the Tyson Research Center now, and the Tyson Research Center has a rich history of amphibian diversity. And I think I saw Owen Sexton walk in, and I'm going to talk about some of his research. Owen was an ecologist at WashU during the 60s and 70s up until his retirement maybe 5 or 6 years ago. And Owen and his group built this pond called Salamander Pond. Why is it called Salamander Pond? Well, I'm not quite sure, but we all think that it's probably because it has the most salamanders that we've ever found in any single pond. It's just chock full of these guys. This is the spotted salamander. It's actually the star of our logo at Tyson. And the spotted salamander is just right now finishing up its sort of breeding migration for the season. It's this beautiful animal that you really only see for a couple of weeks as adults during the year. But what they all do is they go to the pond, they lay all their eggs, and then the larvae develop in those ponds as little mini predators, eating all the insects and other things in those ponds. In Salamander Pond, we've measured year in, year out, 36 or so, it goes up and down a little bit, but 36 larvae per meter squared. That's, a little bit of water, where we're scooping out 36 larvae in every little bit of water. In fact, that's the highest density of salamanders that I've ever recorded, and I've sampled over 250 ponds now in many different states. And why I point this out is because when Owen was working on this and publishing some of this thing, as newspaper our journalists are wont to do, trying to make results seem hot and interesting, there was a bit of work published during this time, during this debate about amphibian declines, where Sexton's results are at odds with the prevailing notion that amphibian populations have declined drastically. In fact, they're doing great at Salamander Pond, you know, and in some ways, the argument was all you got to do is build these great ponds. You know, it's a wonderful pond. It was built extremely well for these amphibians. They're doing quite well. The habitat is there for them. They'll do fine. Okay, and so maybe habitat is an important problem here. And the only thing I want to do is point out a little bit about the context of Salamander Pond, and some of the research that we've been doing puts it in a bigger context, because what turns out is that Salamander Pond is, in a landscape, the only pond nearby in this area. So here's Salamander Pond here, here's I-44 coming down, and this is the Tyson Research Center. And there's another pond way up here, and there's a couple others way over here. But there's not a lot of ponds in the general area. But there's a lot of great habitat for adult salamanders. These guys live, you know, it takes them 6 or 7 years to even become reproductive. And then they live for decades even. They can live for up to 20 or more years. So these things have very long-lived adult stages. And so what we've been doing is toying around with a theoretical model that might explain why we might see so many salamanders at Salamander Pond. And it has to do with the fact that it's the only pond nearby. And salamanders actually need to worry about land as well as water. And in fact, from their population's perspective, they probably care a whole lot more about land than they do about water, because remember, they're in the water for about 6 months at most for their entire lives. But they're on land for 10, 15 or more years. So from a population perspective, what's going on the land matters a whole lot more than what's going on in the water. And what you find is, what we predict is that if you have a certain number of individuals that can live on land, and there's only one pond for them to go to, that's where they're all going to go. And you're going to get a high density of salamanders in those ponds. Whereas if there's more ponds in the area, those individuals can spread out a little bit more because, again, they're limited by what's going on land. And we actually cite, if we're counting salamanders in a pond, we find fewer. And part of the problem here is that amphibian ecologists, because remember, I told you, these salamanders are only out for a couple of weeks a year. They're really, really hard to study. Beautiful animals, wonderful animals, and we don't know anything about what they do for most of the year. We only know about what they do when they do their breeding migrations to the ponds. And so that's where we study them. And so we might say that Salamander Pond has a thriving population, and in fact it does. But can we really say that that population is doing better than another population where there might be lots of ponds around, but they're spread out a little bit more? And in fact, if we look, these are just a few of the sites that we study in our surveys. And this is, again, this is a group of people in my group and in other groups that are doing this. If we look at a variety of different study sites, and we look at Salamander Pond here, it's the only pond in the area, and we go just right across the interstate to Forest 44 Conservation Area. Right across the other side of the interstate. Forest 44 Conservation Area has a whole bunch of ponds. And we find fewer salamanders per meter squared in that pond. But that doesn't necessarily mean there are fewer salamanders in the population. And so here, this is just, each one of these represents a different natural area in the vicinity of St. Louis. And we're looking at the numbers of salamanders per meter squared relative to how many ponds are around, the proportion of water that there is for those salamanders to lay their eggs. And you can see there's many fewer when there's a lot more water around than there are in Salamander Pond, which is way up here. Okay? And so this isn't negating the results that were suggested that, you know, these populations are doing quite well in this Missouri area, but what we don't know is, you know, is habitat really causing an influence on the population dynamics? Because we've only studied, we haven't studied both terrestrial and aquatic stages, and that's what we're just starting to look into. And really it's important to consider both water and land. These guys are fundamentally dependent upon what's going on the land, where we barely have a glimpse into their lives. There's a professor over at the University of Missouri, Ray Semlich, who's been actually radio tracking these guys as they're leaving the water and some of the other related species and finding out very interesting results. We need to really understand what's going on in the land. Okay, well, let's move on from habitat loss and let's start looking at some of these other plagues that humans have put on the amphibian world. And one of the things that people really got into in the mid-90s, and this is Andy Blausing and his group were the pioneers of this research, is most of you are probably familiar with the idea that UV radiation has increased. UV radiation is increased. We all have to wear sunblock. We have to wear our UV sunglasses and so on because of depletion in the ozone layer and chlorofluorocarbons and so on. Well, in fact, that also can influence amphibians, and in particular, some of these high mountain areas where UV is quite high, they lay their eggs right at the surface of the water. And these guys get sunburnt and die. And so we often see mass mortality events in egg populations of these egg masses here due to increased UV. And this is just an experiment where they actually manipulated the amount of UV, essentially gave them a UV filter, and they actually enhanced the UV, as it might happen during global change, to look at its effects on tadpole populations. So UV is also having an effect. There's a lot of research that's been going on in the earlier part of this decade. People have really jumped onto this bandwagon of looking at pollution and how that influences tadpoles. And this is, again, where that quote that I had in the newspaper came out of the wimps of the amphibian world. The reason being, it's not necessarily very surprising that if you put a nasty chemical into these cattle tanks where these tadpoles live, that it will cause some sort of negative effects on these individuals because they are respiring through their skin. So, but nevertheless, there are a lot of results, even at very low to moderate levels, that are related to what we see in nature. Even just nitrogen that we get out of our fertilizers that we put on our lawns as that washes into the water can directly kill amphibians. Roundup, herbicides like Roundup, there's a big debate. Obviously, Monsanto doesn't like this result, but it's a big debate currently about how Roundup can be causes of some of these amphibian declines. Things like Sevin, the insecticide that you can buy at Walmart, has been shown. The carbaryl, which is the active ingredient in there, can not only kill many tadpoles, but the other thing that it can do, which is really interesting, is that it can make their senses dulled to avoiding predators. Many of these tadpoles are very adept at avoiding predators. They're very good at hiding. When the big nasty dragonfly larvae comes around, they're good at escaping or hiding. But their senses become dulled when this carbaryl is present. And so when you put the two together, the mortality is way bigger than it was when each one is separate. So that's that multiple effect, that interaction that I was talking about. Atrazine is another big one, which I'll talk about in a second. Atrazine is a huge herbicide that's used in orange groves, but it's also used in soy and a lot of other crops. Has massive mortality effects on these amphibian populations. The other interesting thing about atrazine, and this is fascinating, it's caused another bit of a battle between some of the larger chemical companies and some of the scientists. And this is some work done by a very charismatic scientist at the University of Berkeley, University of California, Berkeley, Tyrone Hayes and his group, and they have been accused and attacked, and they've been doing the studies back and forth. It's a highly controversial topic, but they've been looking at the effects of atrazine on the development of these organisms. So not just killing them, but fundamentally changing their development. And so this is just a map of the use of atrazine. Again, warmer colors indicating more use of atrazine across the U.S., and it's an herbicide used in a variety of crops, and it washes into the water. We have it in our drinking water. That's all, it's an important pesticide that's out there in the environment. And what Tyrone and his group were able to show was in the lab and in the field, these are just pictures from the lab of the African clawed frog, Xenopus, which you maybe seen at pet stores and other things. But similar results have emerged with wild species in the area, where what they do is they become hermaphrodites. They have both male and female reproductive organs. It's altering the fundamental development as they turn from tadpoles into adults. And so you can see there's both ovaries and testes, in fact, multiple pairs of each in this individual. It's disrupting their development and their hormones. Okay? Well, here's just a tiny little segue about canaries in the coal mine, because, in fact, one of the arguments that Tyrone and others have made is that if this is going on with the amphibians, certainly they're more sensitive to these kinds of things, but we do have these kinds of things in our drinking water, and we need to worry about the EPA standards for these kinds of things. And in fact, there's been some controversy about what the EPA standards should be on these sorts of things. And this is the results from a study that came out right here in Missouri. The data were actually collected from Columbia, Missouri, a bunch of people involved in agriculture. And I don't want to make too much of these data except just to sort of show that this might be influencing humans as well. And these are the percent of men in those samples with an abnormal sperm count. And these are the pesticide score that was found in their blood sample. So it goes from very low, almost no pesticides in their blood, to a lot. And you can see that it had a big influence, potentially, on the human sperm count. So it seems to be altering human hormone function as well. So, okay, we've got the litany of chemicals out of the way. What about other sorts of things that we know alter biodiversity on our planet? Things like invasive species. Well, this one is an obvious one. Certainly it looks like a beautiful plant, but it's actually quite a nasty, harmful plant. This is purple loosestrife, which has invaded wetlands and ponds and things throughout much of the eastern part, northeastern part in particular of the U.S. And what it does is it can homogenize communities. It reduces biodiversity of a lot of other species. It reduces, it dries up these wetlands, and so it's really altering the ecosystem available. There are also results that show when some species of invasive plants like honeysuckle and some other trees, when they drop their leaves into the ponds, those leaves themselves don't break down in the same way and create detritus, which is a food source for a lot of these tadpoles. They don't break down in the same way that native plants do. Many of these invasive plants have allelochemicals or toxins in their leaves that aren't good for the aquatic systems in which they fall either. So invasive plants can play a huge role on amphibians, but a more important invasive species for amphibians are these guys, fish. When you go to a pond at night, and listen, and I'll play a couple of calls for you in a few minutes, listen for amphibians calling at night. Some ponds are just chock full of amphibians calling and chorusing and so on. In other ponds, you almost hear nothing. That's indicative of something going on, and I can tell you right away that pond has fish because it has almost no amphibians. There's only a couple of species of amphibians, 2 or 3 that can live with fish. The bullfrog actually prefers to live with fish, and it tends to be because it's a weaker competitor with some of its relatives. Cricket frogs can also live with fish, and toads can sometimes live with fish. But all the other species that we're talking about can't live with fish at all. And so fish have a huge influence on diversity of amphibians. And so even our little buddy, the mosquito fish, which is often introduced into ponds, people often think that this is a good thing to do, is to put these things into ponds that don't have fish or wetlands because it controls mosquitoes. In fact, there's a lot of evidence that says that they actually don't do a very good job at controlling mosquitoes. And sometimes there is some evidence that says they can actually enhance mosquitoes because they're eating the predators, like little bugs and things that also eat mosquitoes. So that's not necessarily a straightforward sort of reason to introduce mosquito fish into the ponds, and they can wreak havoc on amphibian populations. But more importantly, it's these guys, green sunfish, bluegill, bass, that are often introduced into ponds where they shouldn't be, where they weren't historically. Also in the mountainous regions, we're often introducing trout into mountain lakes. In Yosemite National Park in the Sierra Nevadas, trout have been introduced into hundreds of lakes where they weren't native. And things like the mountain yellow-legged frog are going extinct because of this. And so fish can cause a huge amount of havoc on amphibian populations. Some of you have probably heard of this one, and this is one that I've done a little bit of research on myself. This is sort of frog deformities, and this is another thing that emerged in the 90s as, the canary in the coal mine, the chicken little, the sky is falling. Look at what's going on. We're creating mutant frogs. So we're getting these frogs that are experiencing deformities. This is a Pacific tree frog that has 2 extra hind limbs here. This is a bullfrog that has sort of 4 limbs coming out of its chest. And these are some of the more grotesque ones, but we're often, you often find ones with knobby toes, or, they're often missing a limb, and we see lots and lots of these deformities. And this topic first became sort of publicly announced, notarized, when a group of school children in Minnesota were at a pond sampling, doing the typical thing that kids do, jumping in there and finding frogs and salamanders and other things. And they found a whole bunch of these mutant frogs hopping around, and so it made the press, and it became quite popular. But in fact, scientists had known about these deformities for hundreds of years. We've known that they're present. And so the question, and one of the debates that has emerged, is what's causing these deformities? And there's some evidence that chemicals can influence the deformities. Some of the chemicals that I showed you earlier can influence the development of these things. But in fact, there's one thing that seems to be most important in causing these deformities. So I'll just spend a second walking you through this complex life cycle of this thing, which is a trematode. It's called Ribaroria. It's a trematode. It's a little worm. It's related to swimmer's itch, if you've ever had swimmer's itch, where you're in the water and this little worm embeds itself. It's also related to schistosomiasis, which is a nasty disease in some third world countries in Asia and Africa. And they all have similar life cycles. These little trematodes live in snails for part of their lives and birds in part of their lives. But this particular one also uses frogs. And what it seems to do is it's an adult inside the primary host, which is a bird, and that's where it goes through sexual reproduction in that bird. The bird poops it out. It comes into an egg and a myricicadium, which enters the secondary host, which is a snail. What it does in that snail is it grows and reproduces. It actually castrates the snail, so the snail is no longer reproductive, and so all the food that the snail is eating is going right into making new trematodes. And all those little trematodes swim out and find a frog tadpole, and what they do is they embed themselves into the developing frog tadpole's limbs. And this is where the idea of stem cells becomes important, because frog limbs are stem cells in which they can become any number of different tissues. And so because there's this parasite embedded in their limb formation, they actually sometimes will make multiple limbs, or they'll have a deformed limb, or they'll make extra toes, or so on, because of this cercaria insisting into the developing frog. And what we do is we end up with a deformed frog. Okay? Evolutionarily, this is hypothesized to be so because it helps the trematode get back into a new primary host. It makes this really pathetic frog flop around in the mud and be a really nice, easy meal for the heron. Okay? And so that completes the life cycle. So it's part of nature. It's part of what's going on here. We see these kinds of things happen a lot. A lot of parasites alter their host behavior and morphology and other things. So the question becomes, is this unusual? And in fact, we can find records of this parasite in museums going back hundreds of years. But what's happening, it seems, is that this parasite is becoming more and more abundant. And what our research has shown is sort of why it might be becoming more and more abundant. And we think the reason might be because not a direct effect of pollution on deformities, but an indirect effect. And this indirect effect works something like this. This is just an overhead view of two lakes. One lake, they've dumped a little bit of nitrogen in there to simulate what happens when sewage and human agricultural runoff and other things go into a pond. You can see how mucky it gets, how full of algae it gets, compared to this control pond up here. Well, what happens when you fertilize a pond is it shifts the nature of the food web. And what in particular it does is it shifts the food web, and it shifts the types of snails that can live in that food web. And it makes this snail happier and this snail not so happy because of the food web and predators. This is an insect predator that eats snails. And we tend to get more and more of these big snails, which is called a ram's horn snail. You can find these things at pet shops. These ram's horn snails tend to be the very same snail that's the host for the trematode. So we fertilize a pond, we get more big snails, and then we get more deformed frogs. And so that's sort of the results that we've been just publishing that have shown this sort of indirect effect. So indeed, it's a native parasite that's been here all along, but it's still human impacts on the community and the ecosystem that is creating these deformities through this sort of more complex bit of the food web. Okay, so finally, let's get back to this idea of this precipitous decline. All of this stuff that I've talked about matters, but it's been here for a while, and we've been slowly building up nutrients and pollutants into the system. Can this explain these massive declines that we're seeing? These massive abrupt declines, like these results from Karen Lipp's study that was published a couple of years ago, where you see this precipitous decline of populations, even in national parks, even in these really pristine areas that I told you about earlier. Well, in fact, probably these things aren't what's causing it, and we think now there's pretty good evidence, and this is sort of why we're in the year of the frog and sort of really worrying about these kinds of things, that this beast here is causing a big effect. I'm not going to worry about the name of this thing here. We'll call it BD. It's a chytrid fungus. This is a newly discovered fungus that was discovered in the 1980s, and BD seems to be what's causing a lot of the amphibian decline across the world. And let me give you a little bit of results. So here is what BD does. It is a fungal pathogen, and what it does is it doesn't really affect tadpoles much, but during metamorphosis and after metamorphosis, it eats away at the keratin of these adult amphibians, and so it's really where they get sick. Now, we see BD associated with amphibian declines across the globe. We've found BD in Central America, Australia, in North America, in Europe. We've actually found BD right here in St. Louis, which I'll tell you about in a little bit. It's on every continent except Antarctica. 200 species have been found infected, and it's often found to be associated with these die-offs. These are figures from Karen Lips, courtesy of Karen Lips, or pictures where she, in studying these long-term her long-term studies in Panama and Costa Rica, what she'll find during these die-offs is where all these individuals will go, crawl up onto land, and sort of really try to heat themselves up. And it seems like temperature is playing a role. These individuals are getting really sick and dying because of the presence of BD. And there are two things that are associated with the presence of BD. They've been sort of thought about as alternative hypotheses, but in fact, probably both of them are going on. So I'll present them to you, sort of as simultaneous things that are influencing how much BD is out there, this invasive pathogen that seems to be causing these declines. The first idea is that climate change might be interacting with BD because of this temperature thing that these individuals seem to be wanting to. It seems like temperature is playing a role in the importance of BD. And the other thing is that it might be, we probably think that it is a novel pathogen. We think that is an invasive species that was introduced from another site and causing havoc in these new areas, much like many other invasive species do. And so the climate change idea is this, that we see that BD does best in cooler temperatures. And so during the summer is when we see less prevalence here of BD in the amphibian populations than during the cooler months, okay? So BD is killed by these hotter temperatures. And that actually being one thing that here in Missouri, as you all know how hot it gets during the summer, might be helping out some of our species here in Missouri because they do have BD, but it doesn't seem to be causing some of the mass mortality that we're seeing in a lot of the other populations. It might also explain why we tend to see some of the mortality happening in species that live in cooler streams than some of those that live in ponds. And so this paper by Ken Pounds and colleagues suggested that the extinctions, the widespread extinctions, were caused from this epidemic of these disease that's driven by global climate change. And so they published a paper from the Monteverde study site that I was telling you about earlier, where they were able to show that the percentage of this particular species that was infected by BD was much lower in cool years than in warm years. So as global warming is going on, we might be seeing more and more BD. The other idea is the question about where BD has come from. Well, it seems like we might have seen the out of Africa idea where BD seems to have been native to South Africa. In fact, the oldest known record of BD is from South African populations. And we've found it more recently spread across the globe. So how could this happen? Well, it turns out that there's a pretty good hypothesis for why might this happen due to this guy here, which I've already mentioned, which is the African clawed frog. The African clawed frog, again, is important in pet trade. It's an important species used in developmental biology. It also was early on used in pregnancy tests, where they would use hormones from the woman to introduce to these frogs, and if it laid an egg, she had the appropriate hormones to be pregnant, and so it was used in pregnancy tests. So this frog was introduced across the world, or spread across the world. It's actually become invasive in a lot of habitats in which it was not native to, and it also seems to house the pathogen, but not be killed by the pathogen. So it might be a vector that's spreading this BD across the world. And in fact, there is pretty good evidence that BD seems to be spreading fast in some places. And these are data, again, from Karen Lips, who has some of the most thorough data on this problem to date. And here, again, this is Monteverde that we've talked about already, the cloud forests up in Costa Rica. And we saw massive die-offs in the late 80s of these frogs in Monteverde. And then moving down Costa Rica and moving into Panama through time, you can see these declines are happening sequentially as BD seems to be spreading across South or Central America. And so we do think that BD is playing a big, that invasions are playing a big role in the BD spread as well. So here's the question, and this is sort of why I think we're trying to raise awareness of this problem, is what can we do about this? We've got this devastating disease that seems to be spreading across the globe and driving many, many species of amphibians extinct. And the answers are very difficult at the moment. There are some people, Karen Litz and other people have suggested that maybe there are ways that we can select for different strains of BD that might be less virulent or have resistant amphibian species somehow. We might be able to treat them or inoculate them. There might be a way to treat the frogs and or the environment to kill the BD. We don't really know where the fungus goes, but it seems to maybe stay in the environment even after the frogs have gone extinct. So we might need to figure out how to kill this thing so we can reintroduce the frogs to these populations. And the big idea here about captive breeding, and that's where the zoo has become a big player, is in this idea of the amphibian ark. And this came out in Nature just last week, the journal Nature. It was just an article sort of talking about this amphibian ark idea and how people are just rushing out to these populations ahead of that wave, trying to get ahead of that wave and save some of these species that seem to be really devastated by this pathogen. And so this is just sort of a long quote, but I put it in here because Jeffrey Bonner, right here, the director of the zoo, is the chair of this idea of the amphibian ark. And I think one of the reasons why they've been really playing a big role here at the St. Louis Zoo. And the goals of this thing are to try to get 500 members of 500 different species into protective custody. They're running out and grabbing these things, putting them in bags, putting them into tanks, and getting them into zoos across the world to try to protect these things. But of course, here's the dilemma, right? What do we do with them? We get them captive bred, we keep them pretty well, and there's some pretty good success. There was an interesting success case in Australia where they were able to get a few of these individuals and then release them back into the wild after the BD wave went through, and they seem to be taking off. So maybe there are ways that we can do, sort of help these populations through this wave and try to hopefully get them immune as well. So as I mentioned, we do have BD here in Missouri. It doesn't seem to be causing the massive die-offs that you see some of these other areas, but we have found, and by we I mean the royal we, because Kevin Smith, who's here, and other people in my lab have been the champions of doing much of this work, but we're developing as part of a much bigger program an amphibian monitoring network in the St. Louis area, and we're finding BD in a variety of sites and ponds. It's well known to, in fact, the hellbender and the Missouri Department of Conservation and the St. Louis Zoo and other people are heavily involved in trying to help the hellbenders and protect them from these infections. And what we're trying to do and what we're just starting to develop through some of our work at the Tyson Research Center and collaborations with a variety of other sites is develop a monitoring network. Again, it's part of a bigger project, part of a bigger program where we're monitoring the communities of dragonflies and plants and plankton and other things in these ponds, but we're really interested in monitoring the amphibians across space and time. And we are partnering, here's Tyson here, southwest of the city, but we're trying to partner with the Missouri Department of Conservation, some of the state parks. We've had a lot of luck working with people at the state parks and getting a lot of people on board. We're working with Jeff Brigler at the Missouri Department of Conservation to really try to get this monitoring going. And so here's some of the things what we do, and I just want to play for you a few of these things. If you haven't heard these, eventually we'd like to get to this to a point where we can have volunteers who go out and help us with this monitoring. And most of you might have heard this guy before. That's a spring peeper. And the spring peepers have been calling for a couple of weeks now. They tend to be sort of generalists. They tend to be in a lot of different populations. You can hear this guy right here in Forest Park. It might be a little too cold for him tonight. So that's the leopard frog, southern leopard frog. And then, of course, we have our buddy, the bullfrog. And the bullfrog will pick up later on in the summer. And so what we do is we can monitor these amphibian populations by listening to the number of calling males, by counting the numbers of egg sacs that we see, and by doing a variety of other larval surveys of these amphibians. And we're trying to build a database of where the amphibians are throughout the area. And I'll give credit to Daryl Trimble, who's here, and Jason Knopf from St. Louis University, collaborators of ours, who have been spearheading sort of looking at these ideas in a spatially explicit way, and this is just very preliminary results that Daryl has been playing around with, looking at using geographic information surveys, GIS, to explore the habitat use of different organisms. And what we hope to do is use this framework to explore where BD is and what might be associated with BD in the environment, and what might be associated with biodiversity, how the different animals might be distributed through space and time using some of these spatial network approaches, some of these GIS approaches. All right, so just to start wrapping up, we've talked about why we should care about biodiversity, but I want to tell you one last thing. I've spent a lot of time talking about amphibians. That's not all of my research. That's not all of what we do. And it's not the only, there are lots of reasons why we need to worry about biodiversity, and I told you a little bit about human health with the male sperm count with the atrazine result. But there's another reason why we might want to worry about biodiversity, and that's it might influence our own human health. And there's a couple of other projects that we're involved with at Tyson, my group, and other people, looking at how biodiversity and its conservation might actually influence your own health. And so I just want to put this out there to sort of make everybody aware that even though you should care about biodiversity just for its own sake, there are webs that are so complex that they can step back and influence us right away. Some of the results that we found right here in St. Louis are that bird diversity actually can keep you healthy. When there are more bird species around, mosquitoes are less likely to have West Nile virus in them. Bird diversity seems to be diluting the amount of West Nile virus that's present. We're also finding similar types of results with ticks, and that ticks carry a variety of different pathogens, ehrlichiosis, Rocky Mountain spotted fever, and other pathogens. And we're exploring how biodiversity and the influence on deer and invasive species and other things might alter the amount of pathogens that are in the environment in these ticks. And biodiversity seems to be playing a big role in that. Okay, I just want to wrap up by giving a little plug. And I have some flyers up here, but there's a new program that we've just established at Tyson that I really want to get the word out. We are trying at Tyson, this is I-44 coming down. Here's Lone Elk Park and West Tyson Park going out towards Eureka, the Boy Scout or Beaumont Scout Reservation. And what we're trying to do at Tyson is develop a research program in consultation and hopefully collaboration with a variety of these other networks of natural areas out there. And using this network of natural areas, we're trying to develop a research program on restoration and conservation, which includes things like restoring glades, controlling invasive species, prairie restorations, and this is a set of ponds that we've just built out at Tyson, where we're going to actually do experiments on these amphibians to test some of these ideas. And we're going to continue to do some of this research. And what we're hoping to do is to really bring in the community into this research in a couple of different ways. And the first way that we're hoping to do this is through a grant that we just received from the National Science Foundation. And this is a collaboration between the principal investigators of the project are myself and Peter Raven, but also the outreach staff at Shaw Nature Reserve and at WashU are playing a big role in this program, where we're really hoping to bring in high school kids to get involved into some of these research programs. And so this year we're looking to recruit rising 10th graders to to participate in a research program. You get paid as part of this program to participate in this program. I have some flyers. And what would happen is that we're hoping to bring a lot of students in through that program. And in the next year, as they're rising seniors, from juniors to seniors, they will actually, those who are interested will actually able to join a research group at WashU and some of these other local universities, SLU and University of Missouri St. Louis and other places, where we're developing these research programs to get students involved in the research and try to make the research a little bit more relevant, try to bring in the public and try to make our research more useful to what managers are actually doing. And so I do have some flyers up for there. If you know any, we're recruiting this year a group of students, and we'd love to get anybody participate in this program who wants to. So I've talked about this as me and us. There's a ton of people involved. I've mentioned a few involved in all of this research. Too many to name here: students, faculty, colleagues, at WashU, SLU, the MDC, Mizzou, and other places. We've had a ton of cooperation from the field sites, and we're hoping to get more from a lot of the state parks, county parks, MDC sites. And we've received great funding from Washington University. They've really helped us to set up Tyson as this network of environmental biology research to get us started, and now the NSF and some other funding. So thank you very much.